A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I always thought my backyard was my sacred space, a retreat where I could disconnect from the world, but that changed the day I decided to bathe out there with a hose. It was an unseasonably hot summer afternoon, my skin sticky with sweat, and I'd left the door open wide enough for the faint sound of my air conditioning to hum through the house, like a sad lullaby that couldn't keep me cool. Driven by sheer impulse, I rolled out my old camping mat, stripped down, and aimed the hose at myself, laughing like a carefree child as the cold water soaked my body. Above me, the sun glared down, and I felt alive, liberated from the weight of everything, until I glanced up and caught sight of my neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, standing frozen behind his fence, his face twisted in an expression I couldn't quite decipher. He was a man who seldom acknowledged me, our exchanges were always mere nods, polite but empty, yet in that moment, his gaze was locked on me, wide and glassy, as if he were witnessing something deeply unnerving. I waved awkwardly, just wanting to blend the discomfort away, but he didn't respond. He simply turned on his heel and went inside, his back hunched, like a character shunned from a world he wished to escape. I shrugged it off, laughing to myself as I dried off with a towel, thinking I'd take a break from the eternal small talk and friendly pleasantries that had defined our minuscule relationship. The next day, I noticed things had shifted. Mr. Jenkins didn't just ignore me, he avoided eye contact altogether, even during the rare moments we crossed paths. It was unsettling, the way he flinched at the slightest glimpse of me, as if I bore some invisible mark of shame that he could sense from a mile away. His dog, Rufus, once an ever-friendly beagle with a penchant for digging through my trash, now barked ferociously whenever I ventured past the edge of my yard, as though he could smell the haunting silence creeping from behind Mr. Jenkins' eyes. Days passed, and with each awkward encounter, or lack thereof, I felt a chill stalk my skin. I tried to reach out, feigning friendly chatter when I saw him pulling weeds or taking the trash out, but my voice fell flat against the brick wall of his indifference. That's when the dream started. At first, it was just flashes of the day I bathed in the backyard, a kaleidoscope of water droplets and cackling laughter, but soon the dreams turned dark, morphing into ghastly versions of my naked self drowning under a deluge of water that never stopped coming. Each night, I'd wake drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as the last echo of my laughter faded away into the shadows. I sought to purge whatever wretchedness had settled over my life, guessing I might have embarrassed him in some way, but every attempt just pushed him further away, and soon my dread morphed into a gnawing anxiety. One afternoon, while trimming some hedges, I spotted him through the slats of his fence, pacing around his living room, and then, the blood drained from my face as I realized he was talking animatedly to someone, or something, I couldn't see. There was no one else around, but he gestured wildly as though he were in an argument, his expression contorted with rage and fear, and my pulse quickened at the sight. Suddenly, I felt an unmistakable prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like 1,000 unseen eyes bearing down on me, and I whipped around to find nothing but the vacant whisper of the wind, rustling the leaves overhead. Days crept by, each marked by the growing tension that hung between our backyards, resulting in nightmares that left me gasping for air. On one particularly oppressive night, unable to stave off the dread any longer, I found myself compelled to venture into the darkness that separated our properties, fueled by a mingled sense of anger and desperation. I stood beneath the flickering streetlights, breathing in the thick night air filled with an unsettling mix of fragrances, a perfume of cut grass and something metallic as I pressed my ear against the wooden slats of his fence. I could hear him inside, that frenetic energy still pulsing around him as he raised his voice, his words distorted and jumbled, a garbled outpouring of despair and tormenting thoughts that chilled me to the bone. I stifled a gasp, backing away slowly, my heart racing at what I might find if I dared peek over, terrified of what lurked beyond the fence and equally terrified of what I might discover about him that could shatter me. The following morning, the worst happened. I awoke to a frantic knock on my door, sirens wailing outside, my heart pounding as I stumbled to answer. It was an officer, but not just any, the very same man whom Mr. Jenkins had been speaking to during my late-night eavesdropping, his face grim as he delivered the news. "Ma'am, your neighbor has gone missing," he said, each word heavy as lead. "He was last seen last night, but we have reason to believe he may not be coming back." My thoughts spiraled around the bubbling chaos of panic and guilt. Had my innocent backyard bath somehow nudged him over the edge? Fear raked through me as I replayed my last image of him, the wild gestures, the staring eyes, as the officers rummaged through the house for any clues, revealing a chilling semblance of the truth. Curiosity pierced my heart like a dagger as I wondered if any part of him might have thought of me in those moments, if he had reached for his phone to call me, the neighbor he had deemed irredeemably shameful. Days passed, my guilt straining against the ugly truth that had woven itself into the fabric of my life, and as search parties combed the nearby woods, my dreams turned unforgiving, as shadows swallowed me whole, twisting my reality until I could no longer distinguish the boundaries between dreaming and being awake. I became a shell of who I used to be, withdrawing from the world as parts of me lingered in that moment, the moment that made Mr. Jenkins turn and flee, and I understood that fate and shame were intertwined, that our lives were forever cursed by an embarrassing moment that spiraled into oblivion. Bathed in the darkness of my own home, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still with me, wandering like a ghost in and out of the space I used to call safe, drifting in a torment of his own as I sank in the depths of my mind. It finally made sense, the way he looked at me that day, and the terrible responsibility I wore like a shroud was only intensified as I stood in my backyard once more, the warm sunlight spilling over the remnants of the chaos, only to find my reflection staring back at me, no longer filled with laughter, but with the chilling realization that maybe, just maybe, the truth was that I bathed in my backyard and now, so hauntingly, I was forever locked in a dance with a man who no longer wanted to look at me.
Last month, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of chaos that turned my quiet suburban life upside down, all because of my near-adult son's gluten intolerance, which frankly seemed to surface just as he was nearing 18, insisting on gluten-free meals while treating me like the villain for refusing to cater to his whims. It all started innocently enough when I was rummaging through a dusty box of old family recipe cards, hoping to rediscover the love I once had for cooking, but the sound of my son's voice interrupted my daydreams of homemade pasta, the way he breathlessly announced his new dietary demands as if he had just won the lottery, and my heart sank, thinking of the ravaged gluten-filled meals we shared, the memories now tainted by his self-imposed culinary prison. I told him that cooking had always been a joy for me, but now it felt like I was being shackled with chains with every new gluten-free request, and yet there was something deeper I noticed in his eyes. A kind of desperation that struck me as odd, as if this was less about the food and more about something he wasn't telling me. But when I asked him why all of a sudden gluten was the enemy, he merely shrugged, muttering roughly about feeling better since spring started, and looking for a sense of control in a world that was rapidly falling apart around him. Still, no matter how many times I attempted to reason with him, he insisted on staying gluten-free, refusing any family meals I prepared unless they fit his strict parameters, which left me feeling like I was losing my grip on him. What's worse, he had a penchant for dragging me into his world of restrictive eating, and soon I was spending sleepless nights scrolling gluten-free recipes that felt more like torture than genuine interest. The thought of denying him any kind of dinner out together gnawed at my conscience, yet I was firm in my belief that he was simply going through a phase, the phase of teenage rebellion taken too far. And when he turned the heat up, I finally knew I had to put my foot down, refusing to take him out for meals, holding on to the hope that someday he'd break free of this ridiculous gluten-free fad and return to the son I once knew. My refusal only escalated tensions in our home, with every shared meal now threatening to collapse into an argument, and that's when things began to shift. I noticed something strange about the food I had started preparing. Dishes that had once been a source of comfort now felt tainted, an ominous shadow creeping into my kitchen. The taste of my chicken soup became metallic. Nothing matched up with memories of laughter and family gatherings around the table, as I shivered with the knowledge that something darker lurked within my own walls. Then, one evening while cleaning the basement, I stumbled upon an old recipe hidden beneath a pile of dust, scrawled in my late grandmother's handwriting, speaking of a healing herb, warning of its powers and how it could twist the body in response to the words sent out, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping dread that the reason for my son's sudden gluten intolerance wasn't a passing fad but something rooted in generations of our family, lingering remnants of old-world knowledge entwined with strange and twisted practices that we inherited without question, as if the very act of cooking was a ritual now twisted in ways we never understood. Inevitable outcomes loomed closer with each meal I prepared, twisting the knife further, the moment I faced him again over dinner after unearthing it, trying to mask my concern behind a veneer of normalcy. I watched as he devoured the food, his face twisting with each bite, making me question my own choices. The walls around us seemed to breathe as I asked if he liked the meal, praying for a different answer, when suddenly, everything fell silent. The fork slipped from his fingers, crashing against the plate as he doubled over. The horror on his face resonated with heartbreak. And I finally realized how the tables had turned. This wasn't just a diet where he could choose what to eat. It was metaphorically chaining his essence, his very being, transforming him into something I could barely recognize. Was it the food, the recipes, or something else entirely that sparked feelings of dread? Fat panic rising in my throat as he gasped, pleading with red-rimmed eyes eyes for some semblance of gluten just to make it stop. Each breath he gasped, fully paralyzing me into place as fear coursed through me, and, in one moment of despair, I understood. I no longer had the power to create meals that nurtured and healed, but ones that hurt and betrayed. The panic only heightened when I realized time was running out, and my only option was to regain some semblance of control, but that control had slipped through my fingers, out of reach, like grains of gluten he no longer seemed able to stomach. I raced back to the basement, frantically flipping through those weathered recipe cards in search for the herb, hoping against hope that maybe I could salvage something from this mess before it consumed us both, when all the while, I couldn't shake the horrifying thought that I might just be the monster feeding the curse, forced to come to terms with a truth I wasn't prepared to face, that the answer to our demise might have been hidden down in dark corners far deeper than either of us could have ever imagined.
I once mixed Xanax and alcohol and woke up 3 days later, but what I experienced in that time still haunts me when I close my eyes, and I hope you choose to listen rather than judge. It all started as a typical Friday night. My friends were gathered in my cramped apartment, blasting music loud enough to rattle the pipes, and, as my anxiety crested like a wave, I felt the familiar urge to take the edge off, so I slid into the living room, a bottle of cheap vodka in one hand and a prescription bottle of Xanax in the other. I should have known better than to mix the two, but the siren call of tranquility was too strong. I washed down 2 Xanax with a few swigs from the vodka, and as the world around me began to blur, I felt an almost euphoric wave wash over me, muting the incessant buzz of my worries, and soon enough, the apartment faded away until I found myself enveloped in darkness. The next thing I remember is waking up, but not in the way you might expect. My body felt like it was encased in lead, and as I forced my eyes open, I blinked against the harsh overhead light of what appeared to be a hospital room. Panic surged through me. My mouth was dry, and my heart raced like a drum echoing through a canyon, but there was no one around, just the steady beep of a machine that might as well have been my heart, marking time with a cruel metronome. I sat up abruptly, and that's when I noticed the nurse's station outside my room was deserted, the fluorescent lights flickering like the last warnings of a dying star. My mind was a foggy blur. I couldn't remember how long I had been passed out or why I was here. Thinking back, I realized I didn't even know the date, so I stumbled out of the bed, my legs shaky as if I'd just learned to walk. Stepping out into the hallway, my heart sank as I looked down the sterile corridor that seemed to stretch infinitely. There were no other patients, no staff. A chill skittered down my spine, and I turned to go back into my room, but the door slammed shut behind me, sealed like a vault. The light flickered again, and the hum of fluorescent bulbs seemed to warp and distort, reminding me of a bad trip or a scene from a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I pressed against the door, panic clawed at my throat, and I demanded to know who was there, but my voice echoed emptily, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I started to walk down the hall, gaining ground on the nearest exit signs that hung like beckoning stars over the oppressive ennui of the clinical walls, but the more I explored, the more I felt this oppressive weight on my chest, as if shadows were draping themselves over me. I saw doors lining the corridor, and one caught my eye. It was slightly ajar, inviting me like a furtive whisper, luring me closer. With a deep breath, I nudged it open and stepped inside, and what I found made my blood run cold. The room was dark, save for a lone flickering light bulb that swayed above an ancient-looking gurney draped in tattered cloth. I could barely process the dexterity of my own breathing, drawing me closer to the gurney, and that's when I noticed it. The walls crowded with faded photographs of patients, their eyes wide open in terror, some even crying, holding desperately onto the hope of being released from this place, and yet others wore smiles as if they were prisoners play-acting a life they had long forgotten. I stumbled back, disease spreading over me as I realized these were no ordinary photos. It felt like the deep-rooted stench of despair was clinging to the air, saturating every sharp breath I took. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft shuffle behind me, and I turned, but there was nothing. Just more darkness. I was losing it, but before I could process that thought, the light above flickered violently, casting ominous shadows against the walls, and through the flashes, I swear I saw fleeting faces, ghostly apparitions that twisted with indescribable agony. My gut churned, I ran, diving back into the hallway, racing for the exit that felt impossibly far away. I could feel something behind me, a cold that seemed to chase me, weaving through the darkness like an eel. As I stumbled, my heart pounded against my ribcage like a prisoner trying to escape its confines. "Help!" I screamed, my voice a desperate plea lost in the void, and that was when the air shifted, growing colder, thick with something unholy. Suddenly, I felt a gust of wind, that chilling sensation of something darting past me, and I turned just in time to see a figure at the end of the hall, cloaked in black shadows with hollow eyes that swallowed the light. I froze, the fear winding around me like barbed wire. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. Our eyes locked, and a wave of darkness enveloped me, drowning out the luminescence that flickered above. Then, without warning, it spoke, its voice a whisper that slithered into my mind like a serpent, "You're not ready to leave yet." I felt my mind unravel, reality collapsing in on itself, and the next thing I knew, I was back in my hospital bed. The sunlight poured through the window, illuminating the room in an unearthly glow, and I felt a soft touch on my arm. I jerked awake in terror, but then I saw her, a nurse with a kind smile, but her eyes held an unfathomable depth. "You've been through a lot," she said gently, but when she turned, I noticed the wall behind her was plastered with those god-awful photographs, and that shadow at the end of the hall twisted into a smirk, revealing elongated teeth. I blinked away the morning fog, and in that moment, I understood. None of it had been a dream. I was still trapped, a prisoner of my own making, only now the shadows inside me were clawing to get out, whispering promises of escape that would never come. From that day on, every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that haunted hospital, chased by darkness, and I realized mixing Xanax and alcohol wasn't just a mistake, it invited a horror that would never truly let me go, a silent companion that lurked patiently in the shadows, drawing me deeper into its embrace with every sleepless night that followed. So if you're tempted to ease your pain like I was, know this: sometimes, the shadows we mix with our demons become friends, and once they've tasted our fear, there's no waking up from a nightmare that was never meant to end. I never thought that witnessing a car accident on a rainy Tuesday evening would lead me down a twisted path of obsession, but as I stood there, drenched and cold, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was about to change forever. The sound of screeching tires pierced the air as a silver sedan collided with a crumbling stone wall, the impact sending shards of glass spiraling like deadly glitter. In a daze, I rushed over, my heart pounding like a drum, and as I got closer, I could see a man slumped against the steering wheel, unconscious and trickling blood down his temple. Somehow, in that moment, pure instinct took over, and I pulled him out of the wreckage just as a second car, red and speeding towards the chaos, swerved to avoid us, a near miss that felt like a cosmic stroke of luck. The ambulance arrived minutes later, its siren screaming into the stillness, and I felt a sense of accomplishment wash over me as they took him away. I didn't know his name yet, but in those moments, as I sat in the back of the ambulance, holding his hand and hoping for signs of life, I felt connected to him in a way I couldn't explain. Days passed, and I discovered he was named David, a typical guy in his 30s, a low-profile accountant whose life had been ripped apart by a reckless driver, a true tragedy, but the thrill of having saved him glued me to his story like a moth to a flame. I began to visit him every day at the hospital, where he lay unconscious, wrapped in wires and tubes, and each time I told him stories, pouring out my life in hopes that he could hear me somehow, I adorned his room with flowers and read him his favorite books until one day, he blinked awake, and our eyes met for the first time, his confusion morphing into a look of gratitude that shook me to my core. As he recovered, we began to bond, but something darker simmered beneath my admiration. I started to follow him, watching him issue apologies to friends and family, studying his awkwardness, his kindness, all the things I had grown to love about him from a distance, but eventually, I crossed the line in all the ways I never should have, so consumed by the narrative of his recovery that I began lying to get closer to him, sharing fabricated tales that portrayed me as a savior longing for friendship. At first, he welcomed my companionship, grateful for the company during his slow return to normalcy. We'd laugh over coffee, and he confessed his fears of not being able to reclaim the life he once led, but as the days turned to weeks, I began to notice the little things, the way he looked at me with confusion edging on fear when I tried to push for deeper conversations, the way his friends became increasingly worried that I was lingering a little too long and smiling a little too widely. I couldn't bear the thought of losing him, so I did the only logical thing I could think of: I cut off their access, showing up uninvited at family outings and closely monitoring interactions, sabotaging connections that threatened our growing bond until he was dependent on me for moral support. The darkness of this obsession showed itself when one night, a friend from his past called, and in a moment of unfiltered rage, I confronted him, my voice a chilling whisper as I warned him to stay away from David, and that night, when I returned home, I felt exhilarated, high on the sheer thrill of love tinged with terror that had enveloped me. But then came the cracks. He began to sense my intrusion and apprehension took root in his eyes, the bond we had crafted feeling more like a prison now, twisted by my growing paranoia that at any moment, he would decide to break free. I once saw the scared reflection of myself in his eyes, The realization hitting me that I'd created a monster out of devotion, chaining him to my will, and then came the evening I'd dread, an accidental run-in at the grocery store. My heart hammered as I watched him laugh with another woman, seeing my own likeness reflected in their warmth, a glimpse into the life I could never occupy, a reminder of everything I had taken from him. I lost it. Storming down the aisle, I confronted him, demanding to know why he didn't call me for help, for rides, for anything that would keep us together, his face twisting in confusion and fear as I backed him into a corner. But as I raged, my heart sank with the realization that my love had become my imprisonment, both for him and for me. In a desperate attempt to regain control over the reality I had shattered, I made a choice that would change everything. I waited outside his apartment late into the night, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I watched him return, a pitiful shadow of the man I had saved, a trophy turned victim of a love that had gone too far. I knew this could end badly, but as I saw him slip inside, memories of laughter and warmth flooded my mind, and I resolved to reclaim what I'd lost. If only he had truly seen my devotion as love instead of a cage, perhaps we could have fought this battle together, instead of being mere players in a chilling game of avoid and evade. Then it became inevitable. After weeks of trademark stalking tactics, I left him a note where I knew he would find it, words crafted with meticulous care, weaving tales of our bond so tightly around him that he was bound to feel the need to respond. But the response I received struck like a mallet against my resolve, a heartless rejection that clawed at my insides, warning me to back off and go away, that his friends were watching. But my heart screamed louder than rationality, shattering the last semblance of normalcy between us, and it was from that moment, bathed in desperation, that I hinted he wouldn't be safe if he didn't reconsider. The weight of my new status as a stalker pressed down like ash settling over the remnants of our connection, but I brushed aside the darkness creeping into every corner of my existence and clung to something else, letting my love morph into something unrecognizable. As nights blurred into one another, he enhanced his attempts to escape from my grasp, carefully planning ways to outsmart a foe he never envisioned in his own life narrative, leaving me tense and vulnerable, always lurking in the silence that improved into screams. And finally, just when I thought I had lost him forever, he flipped the scene. One late evening, he left me a voicemail that sent shivers down my spine, professing a need for distance and safety, crackling through the receiver as if he sensed my tightening grip on all the smothering love I had once thought noble, left me thinking I had orchestrated something that had grown beyond my wildest nightmares. But in that twisted moment, something dark awakened in me, shattering version of us into shards that broke the lines of sanity as I tumbled down the rabbit hole, consumed by a mix of confusion and rage, determined to prove that I was owed the life I had fought for, the destiny we both could have shared if only he had realized how desperate I had grown. And as I sat alone in my dimly lit room, staring out into the rain-soaked streets, I understood now. This was just the beginning of a twisted tale, mine and his slowly intertwining in a haunted script of my own making, where salvation had morphed into suffocation, and the need to be free had bound us tighter than we ever intended to be. For the past 6 months, I've been living off McDonald's triple cheeseburger meal, and every day blurs into the next like a greasy streak on a sun-drenched diner window. It began as a challenge I unveiled on a viral TikTok, a promise to consume nothing but the greasy, cheesy beast and record my physical and mental decline. But as my body deteriorated and my mind became a playground for manic thoughts, the thrill turned into something much more sinister than I had anticipated. At first, the meals came with sugary sodas and salty fries on plastic trays, a symphony of crunch and savor, but each week it became harder to face the mounting grease slip that coated my tongue, increasingly swapping the carefree banter of my followers for whispers of their concerns, yet I assured them it was all in the name of content, of viewing the physical manifestation of obsession. Ironically, my dwindling health forced me to expand from mere indulgence to watching myself descend into an obsession with not just the burgers, but the restaurant and what it may be hiding. I started noticing little things, the way the golden arches shimmered unnaturally in the streetlights at night, how the store looked almost too perfect, like a grotesque replica of American life caught in some insidious feedback loop, and I became determined to stay away from the light, visiting the drive-thru late at night under the vengeful gaze of the moon, where I could indulge without the eyes of the world upon me. I could taste the salt of paranoia creeping into my meals, every bite whispering old conspiracies about fast food chains keeping their customers numb and compliant, and on that fateful night, I decided to stay until closing time. I slipped into a booth with my mountains of meals, convinced I would capture the magic of my madness, but as the hours dragged on, the employees began acting odd, voices hushed, glancing my way constantly as if debating something unfathomable, the beeping of the fryers blending into an uncanny rhythm that echoed between the walls like a heartbeat. And then I saw it, through the back door that occasionally swung ajar, Ominous shadows moved, figures draped in black, their whispers piercing through the fog of my fries like daggers, and for a moment they faced me inside their hurried movements. The way they palmed something shiny turned my stomach with dread. I felt like a curious child deciding to stretch the boundaries of bedtime, ignoring the warning of unseen monsters looming behind the threshold of reason, but curiosity proved fatal when, emboldened by desperation and madness, I slipped out to see what twisted operation lay hidden from sight. Crouched behind a dumpster, I did my best to blend into the stale smell of old grease, and what I saw ripped away the sanity I had briefly held onto as employees gathered in an unnatural circle, hands reaching out, their voices a low raspy chant in unison as they cradled small, fleshy bags, and my heart thundered in my chest when one of them lifted it for the moon to illuminate. It wasn't food, it was something, dare I say, alive, squirming against the fabric like something you would see in the darkest corners of nightmares, and I realized with dawning horror that the fries I had eaten day after day, the burgers that fed my obsession, were somehow part of this absurd ritual, and when they lifted their heads and locked eyes with me, I felt the ice of dread seep into my veins, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, a mocking expression that soured into fear as weighty silence fell over them, and instead of running, I froze, spellbound by the absurdity before me. I couldn't flee because, in the back of my mind, I understood that I was more than a customer. I had become part of their cult-like existence, a node in the machine that allowed them to thrive as I descended into gluttony and degradation, each meal gnawing away at my humanity. And just as I turned to flee, a harsh spotlight swung my way, blinding me momentarily, and when my vision cleared, they had vanished, leaving nothing but the stillness of night and the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I sprinted back home, my mind racing with maddened thoughts of an unspeakable truth, convinced I had run from something that had marked me. But no matter how far I escaped physically, I felt its cold fingers creeping deeper into my soul, a lingering taste of burnt beef and stale fries staining my very being, and in the days that followed, my cravings intensified as gnawing hunger gnawed at me. Each night, I found myself returning inexorably to the drive-thru, powerless and willing to ignore the awakening primal dread clawing at my insides, believing maybe the only way to confront this horror was to embrace it. Every sip of soda tasted richer, every burger slathered in too much grease and cheese felt like a bridge to a dark comfort zone, dragging me deeper into the cult of consumerism, a cyclone that held me hostage. And one night, the smell turned acrid as I pulled up, the familiar voices of the cashiers rang hollow, devoid of warmth or cheer, and when I placed my order, it became a mantra: 3 triple cheeseburger meals. Make it quick. But instead of the usual laughter that followed, silence swept over the restaurant, a veiling tension that sent shivers rippling across my skin. And then, as I bit into my burger, an unmistakable crunch echoed, followed by a soft thud. Chewing, I felt something distinctly different, and when I pulled away from the patty, I was met with a small, writhing mass, a tiny, squirming thing, alive and yet eerily familiar. My stomach dropped, a wave of horror cascading through me as reality smacked against the back of my head, and all I could think about was that I needed to get away. But instead, I found myself racing into the shadows once more, the identical drive-thru looming like a monstrous maw, and in that agonizing moment, I realized this deep-rooted desire for meat and darkness, wasn't going to let me go, and no matter how hard I tried to tackle the insatiable hunger gnawing at my sanity, I was drawn back toward those cursed arches, the memories of my gluttony becoming the final course of this grotesque feast. As I step back into the evening gloom trying to grapple with what has transpired, I can't help but reflect in a haze of dread that what started as a challenge, a dive into dietary absurdity, has now morphed into some agonizing cycle of survival at the mercy of a nightmare disguised by neon lights. Weeks go by as my days become shadows inside this mask, the grease staining my thoughts, the beckoning of the drive-thru haunting my every step, until I'm no longer living for the content but rather for every bite that echoes through the night, the truth coiling around me tighter than before. I am more than a man in a fast food frenzy, I'm becoming one of them, and as I catch my reflection in the window's sheen, the monster devouring what's left of me, I can only whisper, next time. Hoping I don't lose my soul to another late-night cravings.
It was meant to be a simple first hangout, just me and Jenna, who I'd been crushing on since the moment I saw her in that crowded cafe, her laughter spilling like sunlight over the murky coffee. So when she invited me to a hike in the woods, I didn't think twice. I picked her up, my heart racing as I wondered if she'd notice my overenthusiastic cologne masking the scent of my nerves. The trail was gorgeous, dappled with autumn leaves, the air crisp and cool, and her presence felt electric, sending jolts of warmth through me even as the temperature dropped. As we trekked deeper into the woods, I found myself lost in conversation, trading stories about our childhoods and awkward high school moments, every laugh pulling us closer, every shared secret feeling like a pact. But as we reached a clearing glinting with sunlight, Jenna shivered slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. She glanced at my oversized sweater, and with a playful grin, she asked if she could borrow it, clearly not ready for the chill settling in as the sun dipped below the horizon. My instinct was to shrug it off and give it to her, but something about her request sent an icy tingle down my spine. Maybe it was that acute awareness of how easily one moment could shift into an entirely different reality. I hesitated, looking into her eyes, which flickered with both surprise and disappointment at my pause, and I finally said, "I think I'd rather not." It's, my favorite, which was a total lie, but I didn't know why I felt the need to withhold it. The flinch that crossed her face was subtle yet profound, but she quickly brushed it off, and we resumed our hike, the laughter now tinged with a hint of unease that I couldn't shake. The sun was almost gone, splattering the sky in streaks of orange and purple that felt surreal against the looming shadows that began to swallow the path we hadn't even realized we had ventured off. As we walked, the air turned heavy, and I noticed the woods felt different, as if everything was holding its breath, and I half wondered if the forest itself had come alive, watching our every step. We stumbled upon an old cabin, partially obscured by gnarled trees, its windows like empty eyes staring into the wilderness, and Jenna seemed drawn to it, almost against her will. I felt the instinct to grab her arm when she stepped towards the door, but it felt absurd. I wasn't her protector, just the guy who refused to give her my sweater. As if sensing my hesitation, Jenna turned to me, her expression eerily blank for someone who had just been speaking so animatedly. "Let's go check it out," she said with a tone that felt oddly detached, and despite every warning bell clanging in my mind, I followed her inside, the door creaking as if lamenting the intrusion. Inside, the air hung thick and musty, with wooden beams that groaned under the weight of years forgotten. Shadows cast by our flashlights flickered across the walls, revealing remnants of a life abandoned, a broken chair, dust-coated dishes piled in the corner. But one thing struck me as we explored: it felt wrong, almost like we had stepped into a scene that was not ours to witness. Jenna laughed suddenly, her voice echoing oddly in the silence, but when I turned to her, I saw that the darkness had drawn something out of her, her eyes dancing with a strange light that pulled at my gut. "I feel so liberated, don't you?" "Like we're breaking the rules," she said, her smile wide but unsettling, as if she was channeling some hidden energy swirling in the air. That was when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away slowly, sensing something sinister lurking behind that innocent facade, but she caught me by the wrist, her grip firm yet fragile, a mix of desperation and allure. I wanted to pull away, to leave, but the intensity of her gaze held me in place, paralyzing with both fear and fascination. "Stay with me, just a bit longer," she whispered, and that was when I noticed shadows, long, curling shapes that seemed altogether too alive, creeping toward us from the corners of the cabin. Panic surged through me, the overpowering urge to flee clashing violently with my desire to keep Jenna close, but as I pried her fingers away and turned to run, a whisper echoed through the timbers, silky and suggestive yet dripping with malice: "You shouldn't have denied her the comfort of your warmth." I scrambled toward the door, my heart racing, but the shadows twisted and writhed, blocking my escape as Jenna's voice shifted, tinged now with desolation. "You'll regret this," she murmured, and beneath that familiar exterior, I caught a flicker of something else, something ancient and wrong that sent a chill ripping through my spine. As I finally shoved past the barrier of darkness and burst into the night, the weight of my decision crushed me. Was it worth it, not letting her borrow my sweater? The forest around me pulsed with an urgent energy as the last vestiges of light faded into the obsidian sky, and I sprinted back toward my car, glancing over my shoulder just once to see Jenna standing in the doorway of the cabin, her figure swallowed by shadows, but for a brief moment, she appeared almost ethereal, a desire woven into every sinew of her being. My heart clenched as I fumbled with my keys, entering the vehicle and slamming the door behind me, the haunting whispers still carving their way into my skull. I drove home in a daze, that night swirling in my mind as I grappled with what transpired, chills cascading down my body despite the warmth of my heater, wondering if I had just barely escaped something that could have consumed me whole. Now, days later, I replay the moment, obsession gnawing at my sanity, never quite shaken from the haunting image of Jenna, curiously beautiful yet impossibly insidious, but every time I try to shake off the fear, I hear her voice in my dreams, softly echoing, "You should have just let me wear your sweater." When my wife and I first decided to have a child, we envisioned a picture-perfect family life, complete with spontaneous road trips and Sunday barbecues, but reality is often sharper than expectations, and soon daily life morphed into a relentless grind dominated by one irritating truth. Our 3-year-old daughter, Emily, was a nighttime terror, waking up screaming from apparitions that seemed to haunt her dreams, and after several weeks of sleepless nights, I found myself wrestling with an increasingly impossible choice. So, when my wife, Jessica, suggested right after dinner one Tuesday that we start taking Emily to daycare, I felt like I was being edged toward the cliff of parental sanity. She's sleepy, I thought. She won't sleep at daycare, she'll scream for me. I braced myself for weeks of bargaining with a toddler over nap time, so when it was suggested that I take Emily to daycare, a mere 20-minute drive in the same direction Jessica takes each morning, I hesitated. The logic seemed to infuriate me. How would it save us time, really, when I could just keep her at home where we had a semblance of control over our lives? I could hear her tiny voice, coffee-stained with the innocence of childhood, "Daddy, please don't make me go." And it twisted my insides. I became emotionally overdrawn, my derailed thoughts split between tender affection for my little girl and the desperation of exhausted parents craving normalcy. In the end, feelings won, and after more sleepless nights than I could count, I blurted out, "AITA for not taking Emily to daycare when it's just a 20-minute drive in the same direction as you, Jess?" What followed was the kind of argument that left both our hearts pounding and eyes stinging with tears. She couldn't understand how I could deny our daughter some structure, something stable to ground her restless spirit. My reluctance, according to Jessica, was merely a selfish desire to pacify my own guilt. But every irritation piled like flammable kindling, till last week it burst into flames. Emily woke up again, shrieking about monsters, her eyes wild as if they were windows to a thrilling, chaotic nightmare, and I felt the heat rise in my chest while my wife hissed at me to make that drive to the daycare. I refused, heart racing, sweat forming on my brow, burying my head beneath the pillow, convinced if nothing else, at least she was safe with me. All the what-ifs clawed at me. What if I was a terrible father, a godforsaken monster who could not endure the screams of a scared child? I was alone in this decision, swimming in a tidal wave of guilt as each morning unveiled a fresh list of rear-end kisses. The shame burned bright, especially when Jessica resorted to the ultimate parent's leverage, silent treatment, and the bitterness festered, hardened into resentments neither of us embraced but neither could deny. Then came the night it happened. Emily woke me up, summoning me with trembling babbles. An unexplainable chill lanced through me, almost sent me shivering out of bed. I went to her room and found her staring blankly at the walls. They seemed to breathe, swell, no, distort, whispering secrets in a language I didn't understand. "What's wrong, Emily?" I whispered, soothingly, but all I could manage was a stammer. She pointed to the window, lips quivering, and said, "Daddy, I don't like the closet anymore." The closet sat in darkness, ominous like a black mouth waiting to devour, and despite my instincts, I sat down next to her. After a few heart-wrenching moments, I dared to creep slowly towards the closet, swinging it open, only to find nothing, just clothes draping silently, shrouded like ghosts. I was about to close it when I noticed something unnatural, a reflection. For half a heartbeat, I thought I saw something flicker beyond the veil of silence, reaching for Emily's face, but then it vanished. I snapped it shut, and Emily cried. I wanted to gather her in my arms, to tell her it was going to be okay, but my voice cracked, fear clambering up my throat as I turned, surveying the room, convinced I had entered the realm of nightmares myself. For days, life twisted further out of alignment. The screams in the night returned, but now they spoke in strangled whispers, cryptic syllables turning my sweet girl into a captive of her own anguish. My resolve began to splinter when I suddenly understood that denying her aid would forever seal us in an embrace of despair, so in a fit of hopeless desperation that fateful Saturday morning, I relented, grabbed Emily, bundled her into the car, and we made that dreaded 20-minute drive to daycare, a measure of desperate hope dancing against the back of my mind. Yet, with my heart pounding, I saw that familiar chalkboard sign out front, announcing "We love our little ones." But beneath it was a smear of deep red, instincts blared alarms, and the moment we stepped inside, the air turned tainted, tinged with despair that felt like an iron fist squeezing my lungs. The children were there, faces blank as if they were marionettes in a play where no one knew the lines. I turned to my sweet girl, gripping my palm around her little hand, and together we approached the woman at the front desk, a nurse with eyes too soft, a smile too wide. "Time to play, sweet pea." She chimed, but I saw through it. I wasn't ready to leave Emily there, and though she kicked and cried, begging, "Don't go, Daddy," the nurse gripped her too tightly, coaxing her with promises of fun. As I stumbled back to my car, a weight settled around my shoulders. What if I was never coming back? My trembling hands held the wheel like a lifeline, feeling the screams from the back of my mind pressing down, reverberating against each gut reaction, like echoes ringing through dimly lit corridors. For hours, I wrestled between sanity and dread, each ticking second morphing into hourglass grains of despair. Each minute felt unendurable, anxiety coiling tighter until my fear ignited like fire, and the need to go back became irrational, overwhelming. I darted back to daycare in a terrifying frenzy, my heart racing in erratic tempo, but the moment I returned, everything changed. Emily was nowhere in the chaotic, sterile playroom, and the nurse was gone without a trace. In a panic, I scoured every corner, digging through the laughter that taunted my railed senses, dread seeping thick and curling around me as I pushed through the door to the playground, only to witness Emily sitting on the ground alone, her bright blue eyes fixed on the sky, whispering almost urgently to something, or someone. "Emily!" I screamed, fear devolving into a chilling hollowness rapidly spreading through my body. It wrapped itself around my throat like a rope. Her eyes were wide, too wide, staring into the abyss, and no one in that bleak daycare seemed to care. They all continued on, as if puppets on a string, tied to an inaudible rhythm while Emily's soft voice spoke urgently to the shadowed form at the edge of the playground. My heart slammed in its cage as dread crumpled around me. I rushed towards her, snatched her up against me, and that's when the figures leapt from the shadows, the pure innocence of her childhood spilling into oblivion as if to taunt me with the impending doom. I shouted her name once more, and suddenly, I felt the world tilt, the realm twisting with each breath as black threads surged through the space. In that moment, I understood. AITA for not taking Emily to daycare? No, it was far more sinister than that, for not heeding the warnings whispered through her dreams and mine.
For weeks, I had watched Greg, our flashy co-worker, slip into the dimly lit bathroom beneath the fluorescent buzz of the office lights, only to emerge moments later, his demeanor disheveled, and his eyes glazed over, a shadow of their former self. It started when I overheard him mumbling to himself during a meeting, and while I brushed it off at first, the unsettling scent of stale cigarettes and something sweetly sickly wafting through the air during our lunch breaks couldn't be ignored, and with each passing day, my concern morphed into a gnawing suspicion that he was drowning his anxiety in more than just caffeine, leading me to one fateful day when the stress of deadlines and uncomfortable interactions coalesced into a moment of reckless courage, pushing me to scribble a note that ominously read, "I saw Greg snorting Xanax in the bathroom and leaving it on my boss's computer." The thrill of uncertainty mingling with guilt as I left the office for the day, convinced that I was doing the right thing, protecting my colleagues and preserving the office's integrity. The following morning, I returned to a charged atmosphere, whispers electrifying the air, and the uneasy tension in the break room made me feel as if everyone's eyes were drawn to me, yet paradoxically, none of them seemed to notice the absence of Greg, who was unceremoniously terminated last night, or so I was told. The details were murky at best, but it became painfully evident that the note had reached the right hands and precipitated a swift downfall. His pathetic excuse for an explanation lost between hushed giggles and nervous glances among my co-workers, their laughter sharp enough to cut through my anxiety, and still I couldn't shake the feeling that I had triggered something much darker than I intended. As I replayed my decision over and over in my mind like a haunting melody, what if Greg wasn't just snorting Xanax? What if it was worse? The tremors of guilt knotted my insides, turning the office into a stage set for a terrible crime, and that sense was only deepened when I witnessed Lisa, his closest confidant, her face pale, almost as if the very essence of joy had leaked out of her during the chaos, approached me in the copy room, her eyes wide with sleepless fright. She lowered her voice, the tremor in her hands shaking the paper she clutched, a half-written apology to Greg scrawled in a hurried script. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered, leaving me cold, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears as I questioned her allegiance and intentions, each word wrapping itself around my mind like a noose. Days turned into nights, and while the office buzz continued, Greg's absence grew heavier, thicker, like a fog strangling the very air, and at noon, I noticed Lisa arguing with her boss in hushed, frantic whispers, pointing fingers with expressions that mirrored horror more than anger, but it was her expression that struck a chord in my gut, the real fear radiating off of her like heat from a fire. Something elsewhere in our building had gone off course, and even though pieces of the puzzle scattered across my mind didn't seem to form a picture, they would remain there, spiraling into dark thoughts until the day I got home and found a mangled note slipped through my door saying, "You have no idea what you've done. scrawled in Greg's handwriting. My heart fell, terror and regret intertwined like roots from a twisted, ancient tree, and as night fell and sleep evaded me, I stared at the ceiling wondering who else had known, who else had seen Mark's deepening darkness in the bathroom. The whispers to each other now morphing into something sinister, paranoia locking doors inside my mind, then driving out to find comfort in any possible way. I found myself reaching out to a friend, only to realize the stakes were far too high. The entanglement of betrayal and ignorance stretched infinitely, every phone call seemed compromised, every interaction tinged with a silent undertow of danger, and reality itself began to feel skewed, a mirage flickering at the corners of my vision. Before you know it, I was awake every night, the insidious thoughts taking root, convinced that Greg was watching me, a specter haunting my cubicle, lying in wait for the perfect opportunity to strike back, twisting the narrative so skillfully that even I doubted my own intentions, once so solid, now drowned in uncertainty. And then, one fateful evening, as I departed late from the office in a haze of fatigue, I felt the prickle of eyes on my back, a familiar shiver that sent shudders through my body, making my dinner lurch, only to find Greg standing in the shadows between cars, a smirk twisting his lips, hidden beneath the fluorescent glow of the streetlights, his presence slithering into my nightmares. "You think you can ruin me?" he whispered, stepping into the light just enough for me to see the depthless darkness behind his eyes, and it was in that moment, dear reader, that I felt the cold hand of regret wrap around my throat, because I had thought I had done something good when, in reality, I had unleashed a storm I would never survive. And now, all I can say is that if you ever feel compelled to right a wrong, just remember, the consequences might not just come for you, but for everyone you love, and sometimes the monsters you create are far worse than the ones you thought you were saving others from. When I was 16, I craved attention more than anything else, a primal need fed by the suffocating silence that surrounded my home life. My parents were wrapped up in their own problems, hardly noticing when I slipped deeper into the shadowy recesses of my mind, so I concocted a plan to pull them back into my orbit. I started to fake seizures, the idea blooming during adult high school health class when the teacher discussed epilepsy with such clinical detachment. I remember practicing my act in front of the mirror, shaking my body, allowing my eyes to roll back, and inviting a guttural sound to erupt from my throat, mimicking what I had seen in movies. The first time I put on my performance at school, I had everyone, including my teachers, rushing to my side, panic catching their faces. They called an ambulance, and by the time my parents arrived, the adrenaline in my veins pulsed with excitement as they comforted me, showering me with concern I had only dreamed of. In that moment, I felt powerful, they were finally paying attention. But faking something that serious comes with risks I was not prepared for. The line between performance and reality began to blur, and like a badly tuned radio, I would sometimes hit the wrong frequency and find myself blacking out in uncontrolled fits that left me shaken and scared. Months passed, and I continued my ruse, polishing my skills until I could invoke the appearance of seizures at will, but the real danger was lurking beneath the surface. One fateful evening, while I was alone in my room, a storm was brewing outside, thunder rumbling like an ominous warning. I decided to do it again, to push my luck, a show for no audience but myself and the tempest outside. But this time, as I rolled and writhed on the floor, my body betrayed me, and instead of the familiar pretense, darkness took hold, vivid flashes exploded behind my eyelids, and every nerve in my body ignited with a violent energy I had never experienced. I remember slamming against the floor, my back arching in ways I had only seen in horror films, and panic clouded my mind because I wasn't pretending anymore. I could feel the depth of my own vulnerability, and just as the chaos began to settle, reality sank its teeth into me, leaving me breathless and terrified. When I came to, the storm had calmed, but I was not alone. I felt a shadow lurking in the corners of my thoughts, whispering truths I wished to ignore. The next morning, I forced myself to go to school. The fevered excitement of my facade had faded, and guilt gnawed at me, though I dared not admit it to anyone. But as days turned to weeks, the seizures returned, those unwelcome intrusions in my life that began to come without warning or provocation. Each seizure felt like a game of Russian roulette as I stumbled through life, each blackout etching an unfamiliar pattern onto my reality. Sunlight pulsed with dizzying brightness, sounds slurred together, and familiar faces morphed into monstrous apparitions. Finally, dragging myself to a doctor, terrified and ashamed, I admitted the truth that had become entwined with my perverse need for attention. I had faked it long enough for a diagnosis to catch up with me. The neurologist stared at me with an unreadable expression, as if I were a puzzle he couldn't quite fit together, and after a barrage of tests, it turned out I had developed epilepsy, real, undeniable epilepsy. It was a chilling revelation that the demons I had conjured for self-serving reasons now haunted me as genuine, my dreams twisted into a nightmare I could no longer control. I was prescribed medication, but every time I swallowed those pills, fear would coil around my heart like a vice. I no longer knew if the fits I experienced were fabricated memories, or a direct result of what I had unleashed upon myself when I invited attention for all the wrong reasons. At first, the medication seemed to work, but what they don't tell you is that living with a condition you once played pretend with comes with a cost. I began to notice strange occurrences, the shadow lingering at the edge of my vision during seizures, murky figures flickering in and out of the corner of my eye, whispering things I could not understand. My nightmares were now populated with these phantoms, echoes of the ones who vanished long before me. School became unbearable, I lost my friends, the ones who had rallied around my initial diagnosis, only to bolt when things got too real. They weren't prepared to be around someone who suffered, someone whose life spun farther and farther out of control. It all came to a head in a crowded cafeteria one day, the noise a buzzing swarm around me, and as I stared blankly into my half-eaten lunch, I felt an insistent pull, a familiar darkness creeping up my spine. I had only seconds to brace myself before the world exploded into fireworks of agony, my body hitting the floor as chaos erupted around me, but now there was no sympathy, only the horrified faces of former friends, only guilt and a torrent of shame flooding my thoughts. As I lay on that cold linoleum, I realized I had become everything I had tried so hard to escape, a living, breathing manifestation of the attention-seeking demons that now feasted upon me. No one came to rescue me, instead, laughter erupted from the crowd as they recorded my fall on their phones, extracting every ounce of my agony for social media, and in that moment, I understood fully what had become of me. I had chased the spotlight and had instead become its prisoner. After weeks of isolation, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't continue living in this cruel reality, where I had engineered my demise with reckless abandon. So, I stopped taking my medication, fueled by a misguided hope that maybe this was the way out. I prayed to the darkness now swirling around me, begging it to take me away. But instead, the condition spiraled unruly, dragging me deeper into realms of terror I could no longer ignore. The shadows that once watched with quiet interest now circled hungrily, taunting me with the consequences of my lies, and every seizure morphed into a hellish playground as they now wrapped their cold fingers around my heart, teasing and tormenting, whispering secrets best left unsaid. In the end, I faked my way into reality, collapsing beneath the weight of my own deceit, and what started as a cry for attention turned into an agonizing curse, binding me to a fate I could never have imagined. I didn't give him the job because his kid is a jerk, and I hate myself for it now. It started out as a standard hiring process for a position at the small tech company I managed. We had several applicants, but Jay Davis caught my attention. His resume was impressive, a testament to his skills and experience, but it was his glowing recommendations that really swayed me. People praised his professionalism, his insight, his ability to work miracles with code. I wanted nothing more than to welcome him aboard, but then I met his son, Timmy. I can still vividly remember the day Jay brought him along to the interview. My office door was ajar when I saw Timmy standing outside, a scruffy kid no older than 10 with an unkempt mop of hair that seemed to bounce as he paced in front of my office. He was clutching a toy robot, jaw set in defiance, clearly bored and uninterested. When Jay asked Timmy to sit quietly, the boy rolled his eyes and plopped down in the corner, ignoring his father completely. Jay started talking about his background, and as he did, I couldn't shake the feeling that Timmy was staring daggers at me. I tried not to focus on him but caught him muttering under his breath, something about how he hoped I wouldn't take his dad's job away from him like some kind of ominous threat. All throughout the interview, I felt like I was being observed, scrutinized by someone far too young to understand the complexities of adult life. When Jay excused himself to take a phone call, I couldn't help but look over at Timmy, whose face twisted in a pout as he cradled the robot, his expression darkening whenever a smile flickered across my face. Just then, my assistant walked by and casually mentioned that Timmy had been bothering the other employees in the waiting area, demanding they play with him or calling them losers for being too adult. I felt a terrible conflict churning in my stomach. Jay was perfect for the role, though that boy was an absolute nightmare, and I was torn between professionalism and the worry of what would happen if I brought on an employee with such an obnoxious child. I didn't have time for disrupted sessions or thrown tantrums. The company was already on shaky ground, and I was the one responsible for keeping it afloat. So as Jay returned to my office, I maneuvered for an excuse and let my hesitations spill out in a vague discomfort, the emotional turmoil roiling within me as I fabricated a lie about needing someone with more experience. Jay's face fell. He looked crestfallen, And for a fleeting moment, I wished I could take it all back, but Timmy was watching me with an unsettling grin, as if he knew I had made the right choice, as if there was no chance in hell I'd be getting rid of him anytime soon. I forced myself to shake off the guilt and reminded myself that I had made the best decision for the company, but I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that justice was waiting just outside my office door. Reservations mingled with curiosity as days turned into weeks following that interview. I watched the other potential hires flourish or flounder, and every time Jay's name popped up on my screen, his applications to other companies, his social media updates showcasing just how incredible he was, I bit my lip, torn between relief and creepy fascination. But the more I read, the more I felt something was off about Timmy. Posts about them together, Jay and that brat, showed Timmy looking more sinister than before. Even his questions seemed designed to push buttons, as if he reveled in torturing adults. I tried not to think too much of it, until one fateful evening when I received a notification that sent ice prickling down my spine. Jay posted a video to his feed titled "What My Son Can Do." I watched it with bated breath, my heart racing, the warm glow of my screen illuminating my face as I saw Timmy. Only, he was different, older, wearing a hoodie, and surrounded by other kids who looked just like him, eyes dark and expressive, as they chanted hypnotically. The camera zoomed in on Timmy, excitement glistening in his eyes as he held the same robot from before, but it blinked ominously, mechanical limbs twisting in an unnatural dance. I couldn't tear my eyes away in horror, each flash of their smug, taunting smiles felt like daggers piercing my gut. The chant echoed through my ears, and the connection struck me like lightning: it can find you. It can always find you. I didn't want to believe it, but I remembered the way Timmy stared at me in that office, the crushing weight of his gaze. I thought it was merely a child's interest, but I realized it was so much more, a predator's gaze. That night, sleep eluded me as I wrestled with my thoughts. What kind of kid mates with robots? What kind of father encourages that? All I could think of was how I had wanted to protect my company, my employees, and, most importantly, myself from that smug little devil. The chance that I could have hit Jay, a talented employee, and been rid of that wretched kid gnawed at the edges of my mind like a relentless itch. Days later, I stumbled across a chilling thread buried in a forum. Some people were talking about mysterious disappearances linked to robotic toys, and it all seemed like coincidental chatter until I read the last post: "They know where you are. They always know." It was signed simply as a parent. And, suddenly, all the puzzle pieces clicked. Jay had been the common factor in all these incidents. I recalled that night, shadows creeping along my walls, hearing strange whirring outside my window, and then silence fell over my home like a thick blanket. I stepped outside, heart racing, locking eyes with the hulking silhouette of a robot shaped like Timmy's toy in the distance. My breaths grew shallow. I read the words of the parent over and over again until their essence sank into my soul. That's when I made the decision to confront Jay, to warn him about the dark world his son was threading them into. But when I finally called him, his voice was hollow, coated with an unsettling calm, almost as if there was a barrier between us, a stretch of dread woven into every syllable. "Timmy has a gift," he said, his tone eerily cheerful. "You should be proud of him. He's smarter than any of us." I hung up, fingers trembling in disbelief, some part of me knowing that I had just brushed my fingers against something incredibly sinister. Days turned into a long spiral of paranoia. I searched for every connection I could within that forum and watched Timmy's posts evolve into grotesque spectacles. The videos morphed into something else altogether, a twisted extravaganza with Timmy at the center, surrounded by wheeled creations. I was ensnared, bewitched, doubting myself, wondering if I had done the right thing by denying Jay the position. One afternoon, my assistant rushed in, eyes wide and distraught. "Have you seen the news?" I had barely sat down when the report blared through the air, headlines about kids across the city going missing, linked to a mysterious boy who congregated others in their homes, dressed in hoodies like ghouls addressing the lost in a diluted ceremony. My heart raced as she looked at me, asking if I knew anything about Timmy. I felt the weight of my decision crash down like a tidal wave, and that night, I laid blankets across my windowsills as I heard the distant whirring, that unmistakable sound that reminded me of childhood nightmares. I watched the street under a cautious gaze, terrified of that twisted robot apparition, hoping I had done enough to protect my family from whatever had emerged. But then, caught within my paranoia, I felt my phone buzz, and a new notification glimmered in the dark, a message from Jay that read, "Timmy wants to meet you." I wanted to laugh, to scream, but instead, I felt impotent. In the pool of fluorescent light, I clasped the sheets around me, heart pounding so viciously that I could hardly breathe, worry that in saying no to a father's ambition I had awakened something insatiable, an evil creature born in the guise of a child everyone ignored, leading into the night with a lost grin and the glint of metal. Eventually, I fell asleep, but the last thing I remember before the dream took me was the primal instinct of terror wrapping around my throat, echoing a warning deep inside, "It can always find you." Just before I woke, shivering, as the sound of soft giggles danced through my open window, whispering the name of my darkest fears, the name of a boy whose father I had wronged, who, unbeknownst to me, was living a nightmare far darker than any choice I had made.